My mom chose a cat over my newborn. Then I stopped the transfers. I was still bleeding from the delivery when I called my mother, and she told me she couldn't come because her cat had a grooming appointment. I remember exactly where I was standing when she said it. I was in the hospital bathroom, holding onto the little metal handle bolted to the wall, because I still couldn't stand for more than a minute without the room tilting sideways. My daughter Nora was 6 hours old. My husband Marcus was down the hall filling out paperwork. And I had the phone pressed so hard against my ear that it left a mark, because some part of me thought if I just listened harder, I would hear something different than what she was actually saying. Mom, I just gave birth. I know, sweetheart. I'm so proud of you. But Mr. Whiskers has been waiting 3 weeks for this appointment, and you know how he gets if his nails aren't trimmed. He starts scratching the furniture. I laughed. I actually laughed because for a second I thought it was a joke, the kind of dry, deadpan thing my mother sometimes said to see if you were paying attention. But she didn't laugh back. She just kept talking, something about the vet's cancellation policy, something about how she'd come by sometime this week, once things calmed down. Things calmed down. As if a newborn was a storm that would eventually pass, and not a permanent breathing person who was, at that very moment, asleep in a plastic bassinet 20 feet away from me with her fists curled up by her ears. I want to tell you that this was the moment everything changed. But it wasn't. Not yet. Because here's the thing about a lifetime of small disappointments, they don't arrive like an explosion. They arrive like water finding a crack in a foundation, slow and patient, and you don't notice the damage until the day the whole wall gives out. For 11 years, every single month on the 3rd of the month, $400 left my checking account and landed in my mother's. I had set it up back when my father died and left her with medical debt and a mortgage she couldn't carry alone on her part-time job at the pharmacy. I was 26. I didn't think twice. She was my mother. She had raised me, mostly alone after Dad passed, and when she cried on the phone about the collection calls, I did what any daughter would do. I opened my banking app, set up a recurring transfer, and told myself it was temporary. 11 years is not temporary. But I never questioned it because that's not how our family worked. In my family, you didn't ask where the money went. You just gave it, and you were grateful you had the chance to give it because that's what a good daughter did. My older brother, Daniel, never gave a cent. Daniel had a lot going on. Daniel had his own problems. Daniel got to be the golden child who visited twice a year and got treated like a war hero for showing up, while I was the one paying the electric bill in the background, quietly, invisibly, the way water runs under a house without anyone thinking about it until the pipes burst. I didn't resent it. Not really. Not consciously. I told myself that was just how families worked. Some people show up with flowers, some people show up with money, and both mattered. What I didn't understand yet, standing in that hospital bathroom with my hand shaking on the door handle, was that I had been quietly financing a lie for over a decade, and that the truth of where that money had actually gone would come apart in my hands piece by piece over the following weeks, until I was holding something I almost didn't recognize as my own life. My mother did eventually visit. 9 days later, she walked in wearing a cardigan I didn't recognize, carrying a gift bag with tissue paper so perfectly fluffed it looked like she'd practiced fluffing it. Inside was a single onesie, the cheap kind from the clearance rack, still creased from the packaging. She held Nora for exactly 4 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the wall behind her head, the way you watch a clock during a job interview that isn't going well. Then she handed the baby back to me, said Nora had her father's forehead, and asked if I had any coffee that wasn't decaf. While she drank her coffee at my kitchen table, her phone buzzed. She smiled at the screen in a way she never smiled at me, and turned it so I couldn't see, but I caught a glimpse of a photo, an orange cat sitting on a windowsill wearing what looked like a tiny knitted sweater. She typed back something with both thumbs, fast, practiced the way you text someone you talk to constantly. "Who's that?" I asked, just to make conversation, exhausted, running on maybe 5 hours of broken sleep spread across 3 nights. "Oh, that's just Karen. From the cat sanctuary." I didn't think anything of it. Why would I? My mother loved cats. She'd had cats my whole life. It was such an ordinary, harmless thing to say that I forgot about it within the hour, distracted by Nora's crying, by the soreness in my body, by the fog that swallows the first few weeks after birth and makes every day feel like the same 24 hours on a loop. It wasn't until 3 weeks later that the name Karen came back to me, and by then it came back attached to something that made my stomach drop straight through the floor. It started with an email that wasn't even meant for me. My mother had for years used my email address as a backup contact on some of her accounts, ever since Dad passed and she'd panicked about losing access to everything. I'd forgotten this completely. So when an automated statement notification landed in my inbox from a credit union I didn't recognize, addressed to her, I almost deleted it as spam. But something made me open it. Maybe it was the exhaustion making me careless, or maybe some part of me already sensed that a thread had come loose somewhere, and I was about to start pulling it without meaning to. The email referenced an account ending in 4471. A joint account. My mother's name and a second name I didn't recognize. Karen Fitzsimmons. I stared at that name for a long time, nursing Nora with one arm, scrolling with the other. Karen Fitzsimmons. The name from the cat sanctuary. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe they'd opened some kind of shared account to fund the sanctuary. Maybe my mother had finally found a hobby that made her happy and I should just be glad for her instead of suspicious. But then I noticed the account had been open for 6 years. 6 years. Long before any cat sanctuary. Long before Karen Fitzsimmons existed in any conversation my mother had ever had with me. I didn't say anything to Marcus yet. I don't fully know why. Maybe because saying it out loud would make it real, and some small stubborn part of me still wanted to believe there was an explanation that didn't make my chest feel the way it currently did, tight, cold, like I'd swallowed a stone. I decided to ask my grandmother. My grandmother, my mother's own mother, was 81 years old and sharper than anyone gave her credit for. She lived 40 minutes away in the same little brick house she'd lived in since 1974, and she was the only person in my family who had ever told me the truth even when it wasn't comfortable. When my father died, she was the one who sat with me on her porch and said quietly, "Grief makes people either better or worse, and I don't know yet which one your mother is going to be." She'd been right to wonder. I brought Nora with me, strapped into her car seat, and my grandmother made tea the way she always did, too strong, in cups older than I was. I told her about the account. About Karen Fitzsimmons. About the birthday gift bag with the tissue paper fluffed like a performance. My grandmother went very quiet. She stirred her tea for a long time, longer than the sugar needed. "Karen," she finally said, "used to be your mother's coworker. At the pharmacy. Years back." "Okay," I said slowly. "So they're friends." "They're more than friends, sweetheart. I always suspected. Your mother's never said it out loud to me, not directly, but I'm not blind. I've seen the way she talks about her. I've seen the vacations she says are work conferences." I sat with that for a moment. It wasn't the affair itself that shocked me. My mother was a grown woman, she'd been widowed for over a decade. She was entitled to love whoever she wanted, and honestly, some small part of me felt a flicker of something like relief, that maybe she wasn't as alone as I'd always assumed. That wasn't the problem. The problem was the money. Because if Karen Fitzsimmons had been in my mother's life for 6 years, quietly, secretly sharing a joint account, then the story I'd been told, the story that had justified over $60,000 of my own hard-earned money over more than a decade, might not have been true at all. "Grandma," I said, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be, "did Mom actually need help with Dad's medical debt? Back when I started sending her money." My grandmother looked at me for a long moment, and I watched something shift in her face, some decision being made behind her eyes about how much to protect me from and how much I was finally old enough to hear. "Your father's debt was paid off within 2 years, she said. "I know because I helped her with some of it myself back at the start. After that, I always assumed you knew she didn't need it anymore." I felt the floor of my entire adult life quietly crack beneath me. I want to be clear about something because I think it matters. I wasn't angry in that moment about the money itself. $60,000 is a lot, yes, and it stings, yes, but money can be earned again. What broke something inside me was smaller and sharper than that. It was the fact that for over a decade I had skipped vacations, driven a car with 200,000 miles on it because I couldn't justify replacing it, said no to a nicer apartment before Marcus and I bought our house, all while quietly telling myself I was doing something noble, something that mattered, something my father would have been proud of. And the entire time, I had been funding a woman's second secret life, one that apparently included cat sweaters and joint accounts and grooming appointments more urgent than her own granddaughter's birth. I drove home that night with Nora asleep in the back seat, and I didn't cry. I want you to understand that. I didn't cry and I didn't call my mother screaming, And I didn't do any of the things you might expect from a story like this. I just felt something inside me go very, very still and very, very quiet, the way the air gets still right before a storm changes direction. I decided I needed proof before I said a single word. Not because I doubted my grandmother, I didn't, not for a second, but because I knew my mother. I knew that if I came to her with nothing but a name and a feeling, she would spin it, soften it, turn the whole conversation into me being the unreasonable one, the ungrateful one, the daughter who couldn't just be happy for her mother finding love later in life. I needed something she couldn't talk her way around. So I started digging. Quietly. Carefully. The way you defuse something, not detonate it. I still had access to an old shared cloud storage account from years back. One we'd set up together when I helped her scan our family photos after Dad died, so she wouldn't lose them if her old computer finally gave out. I hadn't looked at it in years. But I remembered the password because it was the same password she used for almost everything. My father's birthday, followed by an exclamation point, a habit I'd nagged her about for years and she'd never bothered to change. Inside, mixed in with photos of Christmases and a blurry video of me at my college graduation, there was a folder labeled Taxes, Do Not Delete. I almost skipped past it. But something made me open it. Inside were 7 years of bank statements for the account ending in 4471. I sat at my kitchen table at 11 at night, Marcus asleep upstairs, Nora finally down for what I hoped would be a 4-hour stretch, and I went through every single one of those statements line by line on my laptop, my hands cold even though the house wasn't. The pattern became clear almost immediately. Every third of the month, a $400 deposit. My transfer. Landing not into her personal checking, the one she'd shown me years ago, the one she claimed was drowning in medical bills, but into this joint account with Karen. And from that account over and over I saw the withdrawals. A $1,200 deposit on a rental property in another state, listed as a cabin. The kind of thing you'd buy as a weekend retreat, not the kind of thing a woman drowning in debt could afford. Recurring payments to something called Whiskerwood Feline Sanctuary, which it turned out when I searched it later wasn't a non-profit at all. It was a boutique cat boarding and grooming business that Karen personally owned. My mother hadn't just been visiting a cat sanctuary. She had been helping fund her girlfriend's small business with money that I had been sending her under the belief that it was keeping the lights on in her own home. There was more. A payment for years back for $18,000, memo line simply reading Inheritance, Dad. I stared at that line for a long time before I understood what I was looking at. My father, before he died, had set up a modest trust, nothing extravagant but meaningful, meant to be split evenly between me and Daniel when we each turned 30, a detail I only vaguely remembered from being 17 and half listening during a conversation adults were having above my head at the kitchen table the year he was diagnosed. I had turned 33 years earlier. No one had ever mentioned a trust to me again. I'd assumed, if I thought about it at all, that it must have been absorbed into the medical debt, into the mortgage, into whatever emergency had swallowed it before it ever reached me. It hadn't been swallowed by an emergency. It had been transferred quietly for years ago into that joint account with Karen. My inheritance. My father's last gift to me, sitting in an account that funded cat boarding vacations and a cabin 2 states away, while I sat in a hospital bathroom 9 days ago being told a grooming appointment mattered more than my daughter's birth. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at that table until the sky outside started turning gray, printing out every statement I could find, organizing them by date, building a folder the way you build a case, because somewhere in that long quiet night, I stopped being a hurt daughter and started being someone who needed the truth laid out so plainly that no one could talk their way around it. I still didn't confront her. Not yet. I told myself I needed one more piece, the piece that would make the picture undeniable, and I found it 2 days later almost by accident when Daniel called me. Daniel never called me. In 11 years I could count the number of times he'd called me first on one hand. So when his name lit up my phone, I answered with my heart already hammering, half expecting news about our mother being sick or worse. Instead, he was calling about the family trip. He mentioned it casually, the way you'd mention weekend plans, assuming I already knew, assuming I'd been included in a conversation I'd never once been part of. Apparently my mother, Karen, and Daniel had all gone to that cabin together twice in the past year. Daniel had known about Karen for at least 2 years. Daniel had stayed at the cabin my inheritance helped pay for. Daniel had never once mentioned any of it to me, not because he was trying to hide something maliciously, I think, but simply because it never occurred to him that I mattered enough in this equation to be told. Wait, I said carefully, keeping my voice level. You knew about Mom and Karen? There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that told me he suddenly realized he'd said something he wasn't supposed to say. I mean, yeah, for a while. I figured you knew too. And the cabin? Another pause, longer this time. It's nice, actually. You should come sometime. Mom said she wanted to use some of the... He stopped himself, but not fast enough. Some of the extra money to fix up the porch. Extra money. I sat with those two words long after we hung up. Extra money. Not emergency money. Not debt money. Extra. I want to tell you what it feels like in that moment, to realize that everyone around you has been living inside a version of reality you were deliberately kept out of. It isn't like anger, not exactly. It's more like vertigo. Like standing in a room you've lived in your whole life and suddenly noticing the floor is at a slight tilt, and you don't know how long it's been tilted or how you never noticed before, or how many other people have been standing comfortably on it while you were the only one sliding. I didn't yell at Daniel. I didn't call my mother in a rage. I did something quieter, and I think looking back it was the moment I stopped being the version of myself that had spent 11 years hoping to be seen, and started being the version of myself who understood that being seen was something I was going to have to arrange for myself. I opened my banking app. I found the recurring transfer, the one that had left my account every third of the month for over a decade. I canceled it. Took 4 seconds. 4 seconds to undo something that had quietly shaped the entire architecture of my adult life. I sat there afterward, staring at the confirmation screen, waiting to feel something enormous. Instead, I felt strangely calm, the way I imagine you'd feel after finally setting down something heavy you'd carried so long you'd forgotten it had a weight at all. The transfer had always gone out automatically, so it took 9 days before my mother noticed. She called me on a Tuesday afternoon, Nora fussing on my hip, and her voice had an edge to it I rarely heard, brittle and confused. Did something happen with the bank? My deposit didn't come through this month. I looked at Nora's small, furious face, red from crying about nothing more serious than a wet diaper, and I felt something in me settle into place, like a key finally finding the right lock. No, I said. Nothing happened with the bank. I stopped it. Silence. The kind of silence that has texture to it. Why would you do that? I didn't raise my voice. I want you to understand that because I think it matters more than anything else in this story. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I said simply, because I know about the account with Karen. I know about the cabin. I know about Dad's trust. The silence that followed lasted so long I actually pulled the phone away from my ear to check the call hadn't dropped. I can explain, she finally said, and her voice had shifted into something smaller, something scrambling. I know you can, I said. I'd actually like you to. In person. This Sunday. Bring whatever explanation you have. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I simply told her calmly that I had documents, and that I would be sharing them with her, and that I hoped she had a good reason, because right now the only story I had was one where I paid for her second life while she couldn't be bothered to show up for the birth of her granddaughter. Then I said goodbye gently and hung up and sat in my kitchen with my daughter in my arms, feeling for the first time in 11 years, like I was finally standing up straight. Sunday came and I invited my mother, Daniel, and my grandmother to my house on my terms in my kitchen at my table. I didn't invite Karen. This wasn't about her. This was about the story I'd been told, and the story that was actually true, and the 11 years in between where those two stories had quietly diverged without my permission. My mother arrived first, wearing that same cardigan, her face carefully composed in a way that told me she'd rehearsed something on the drive over. Daniel arrived looking like he didn't fully understand why he'd been summoned, still under the impression, I think, that this was some kind of misunderstanding that would resolve itself if everyone just stayed calm and let Mom explain. My grandmother arrived last, and when she sat down beside me instead of beside her daughter, I watched something flicker across my mother's face, some recalibration of who was actually on whose side. I didn't raise my voice once during that conversation. I laid the folder on the table, the one I'd built over those sleepless nights, and I slid it toward her instead of throwing accusations at her, because I wanted her to see the evidence with her own eyes instead of hearing my interpretation of it. The account ending in 4471, I said quietly, opened 6 years ago. Joint with Karen Fitzsimmons. My mother's hand hovered over the papers but didn't pick them up. The $18,000, I continued, transferred 4 years ago, memo line reading inheritance, Dad. That was supposed to be split between me and Daniel when we turned 30. I turned 33 years ago. No one ever mentioned it existed. Daniel shifted in his seat. I watched the exact moment the pieces connected in his mind, the exact moment he understood that this cabin he loved so much, the one he'd casually invited me to, had been paid for partly with money that was legally, morally mine. And the $400 a month, I said, my voice still level, still calm, that I've sent you every single month for 11 years, because you told me you needed it for Dad's medical debt. Grandma tells me that debt was paid off within 2 years. So I'd like to understand where the other 9 years went. My mother's composed expression finally cracked. Not into anger, which I had braced myself for, but into something smaller and more pathetic, a kind of scrambling, wounded justification, the tone of someone who has told a lie so many times they've started to believe their own softened version of it. I was going to tell you about Karen eventually, she said. I didn't want you to judge me. And the money, it wasn't like I was stealing from you, sweetheart. I'm your mother. Everything I have is. Everything you have, I interrupted, gently but firmly, includes $18,000 of my father's money that belonged to me, and a cabin I've never been invited to, and a business you've been quietly funding with money I earned while working overtime shifts and skipping vacations, because I thought you needed it to survive. My grandmother beside me said nothing, but I felt her hand settle over mine on the table, steady, grounding, the way she used to hold my hand at my father's funeral when I was too young to understand grief but old enough to understand loss. I didn't ask my mother to pay me back that day. I want you to understand that too, because this isn't a story about revenge in the way people usually mean it. I didn't scream, I didn't cut her out of my life on the spot. I didn't post anything online or humiliate her in front of strangers. I simply told her calmly that the transfers were over permanently, that I expected the remaining balance of my father's trust to be returned to me within a reasonable time frame, and that going forward, if she wanted a relationship with her granddaughter, it would have to be built on honesty instead of guilt, because I no longer had the capacity to fund a version of her life she'd never once let me see clearly. She cried. Daniel sat very quietly, staring at the folder, and I think in that moment, some small resentment he'd carried toward me for being the responsible one finally reorganized itself into something closer to understanding, maybe even shame, for how easily he'd accepted a version of comfort that had never once made him ask where it came from. The weeks after that were quiet in a way I hadn't expected. My mother didn't fight the return of the trust money. I think some part of her, faced with actual documentation instead of vague accusations, understood she had no ground left to stand on. It came back to me in installments over the following months, deposited into an account I'd opened specifically for Nora. The same account I now used to save for her future instead of funding someone else's secret one. My relationship with my mother didn't end, but it changed shape entirely, the way a bone sets differently after it's been broken and reset. She started actually showing up to Nora's pediatrician appointments, to small Sunday dinners, not because she was performing motherhood for an audience anymore, but because I think for the first time in years she understood that showing up was the only currency I was still willing to accept. Karen, I later learned, wasn't some villain in this story, not really. She was simply a woman my mother had loved quietly and dishonestly for 6 years, too afraid of judgment to be honest about either the relationship or the money, and in trying to protect one secret, she'd built an entire structure of smaller secrets around it until the whole thing became something she could no longer control. I don't hate Karen. I don't even think about her much. She wasn't the one who owed me an explanation. I think about that hospital bathroom sometimes, the cold tile under my feet, the metal handle I gripped so hard it left a mark on my palm, my mother's voice on the other end of the line talking about a cat's grooming appointment while my daughter slept 20 feet away, unaware of anything except the fact that she was warm and fed and alive. I think about how small that moment felt at the time, how easy it would have been to let it pass, to laugh it off the way I almost did, to keep sending $400 a month for another 11 years without ever asking a single question. But that moment cracked something open in me, quietly, the way water finds the smallest fracture in a foundation and widens it, patiently, until one day you finally see the whole structure for what it actually is. Nora's older now. She doesn't know any of this story yet, and someday when she's old enough, I'll tell her, not as a warning about her grandmother, but as a lesson about the difference between love that shows up with grand gestures dressed as sacrifice, and love that simply shows up consistently, honestly, without needing anything in return. I still think sometimes about the sound of that hospital hallway, the beeping machines, the tired nurses moving quietly between rooms, and my own voice, thin and confused, asking my mother if she was coming. I don't feel bitterness when I remember it anymore. I feel something closer to gratitude, strange as that sounds, because that small, absurd moment about a cat's nails being trimmed was the crack that let the light in, and without it, I might have spent another decade quietly funding a life I was never invited into, believing the whole time that it was love. It wasn't love. It was habit dressed up as love. And it took a newborn's first breath and a grandmother's honesty and a folder full of bank statements at 11 o'clock at night to finally show me the difference. I stopped the transfers. And for the first time in 11 years, I finally started keeping something for myself.